In his latest op-ed, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb focuses on the CDC. He says that the agency needs to streamline and publish clinical data to try and help doctors on the front lines. Dr. Gottlieb joins us this morning. Of course, he's also a CNBC contributor, and he serves on the boards of both Illumina and Pfizer. And Dr. Gottlieb, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks.
Let's talk a little bit about this op-ed. I think it's unusual for you to be so pointed in criticism of one of the other agencies, because having led the FDA, I know that you tread very lightly on this, but that's why what you say, I think, we should all take to heart on some of these issues. You say that the CDC really needs to do more to be helping the doctors on the front lines, just in terms of some of the information that's been collected. Can you be a little more specific and explain to the viewers?
Yeah, well, it's unclear to me why the CDC hasn't been reporting as much as it should be or could be in the setting of this public health crisis. But what you would typically see the CDC do is put out weekly data, sometimes in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, the reports that they issue, that would effectively be the collected clinical experience in the United States of how patients are doing with COVID-19. So remember, we now have about 1.4 million people who've had the infection, many more than that, actually. We're probably missing a lot of diagnosed cases. But we've had hundreds of thousands of patients hospitalized, more than 90,000 dead. What you want to see is reporting from the CDC that starts to aggregate that information and basically put out reviews and series detailing what patients were hospitalized, what their condition was, what interventions they had, and what outcomes they had. You can't do exquisite clinical research in the setting of a public health crisis. It's very hard, although we're doing a lot of it. But what you want is just that bottom line reporting on how patients are faring. China put out very good data in that regard, and we learned a lot from it. The United Kingdom's been putting out very good data, particularly around the patients being admitted to their ICUs. We've put out very little of that data. And I think the syndrome with the children that's been in the news recently, where you saw New York City health officials put out a lot of bottom line data about those conditions, where you saw Italy put out some of that data, and then the UK reported on it April 26th. You just saw late last week, the CDC put out its first statement about that, and it really didn't detail the different cases. Normally, you would see the CDC putting out that bottom line data, and that can help guide clinical practice. There's a lot we're learning about this virus as we go, basically through trial and error and also word of mouth.
Yeah, word of mouth and also through the internet. You pointed out that there's a lot of Twitter threads and other things that are doing this. What are maybe two or three of the things that you think the CDC could have put out some information on, things that we've kind of learned about through word of mouth and, frankly, through talking to you?
Well, early information about the blood clotting that doctors were seeing. We now think that a lot of patients who decompensated quickly, who got intubated quickly in the hospitals and their oxygen saturations, their oxygen levels fell quickly, some of those patients probably had blood clots that were going to the lungs. We've learned that, and now doctors are experimenting with different drugs to try to affect what seems to be the virus activating platelets and causing blood to clump. So documenting that experience early would have been important. We've now have autopsy data coming out of other countries looking at that. That's an example, the inflammatory condition that you see some patients get, where we think that part of what's making people very sick is the immune system over-responding to the virus and actually attacking parts of the body, and then the different medicines that doctors are experimenting with. Also, what we're learning about intubation, about putting patients on breathing machines. We're now learning that we probably should be waiting a little longer and not being as aggressive to intubate patients. Again, if we had more information about the collected clinical experience, sort of aggregated in a systematic way, those insights could have probably happened or maybe happened sooner, and we could have been innovating clinical practice sooner. We're going to be in good shape going into the fall if this does return, because we're going to know how to treat patients better. But in the setting of this epidemic, that information was very slow to be aggregated.
What do you think happened just because the CDC really kind of fell down in terms of the testing, and there's been a lot of back and forth about how they were slow to this. To this point, the CDC, I think, has always been kind of the gold standard around the globe. What happened?
Well, I disagree with the idea that they fell down the testing. The CDC was slow to roll out that test. There were problems with that test, but that really wasn't the challenge that we had with respect to trying to get testing in place early on to try to do what we would call sentinel surveillance, basically try to detect this virus earlier while it was still spreading in the United States in small numbers. Even if that test had rolled out perfectly and they had given that to the public health labs and the public health labs had stood up their laboratories, we still wouldn't have had enough testing in place. What needed to happen was we needed to get the commercial labs and the large academic center labs into the game earlier. That someone needed to call the CEOs of LabCorp and Quest sometime in January or at least in early February and say, hey, we need you guys to do this. We need you guys to stand up your laboratories because they're the only ones with the throughput to be able to do the scope of screening that would have been required to do true sentinel surveillance. So saying that the problems with the diagnostics and the surveillance system was the challenges that CDC had rolling out the test just isn't the case.
Hey, Scott, I don't know. I read a piece that kind of walked through step by step, and it looks like they cross-contaminated a lot of the tests that they sent out. They were very slow to react to that, very slow to pull it back, and didn't follow through with some of the very basic things, like you shouldn't be creating these tests and creating some of them in the same places where you were studying the coronavirus, because that's a complete violation of the scientific standards that would have been required for any of that. That sounded like it was a pretty big falling down by the CDC.
And that's all, and that looks to be true. But even if they hadn't made those mistakes, we still wouldn't have had enough diagnostic testing. That test that they were developing was going to go to the public health labs, which don't have a lot of throughput. It's just, people saying that the reason we didn't have surveillance in place was because the CDC test didn't work. Simultaneous to that, the CDC working on that test, we also should have been spinning up the commercial labs. And that would also give us a backup plan. We put all our eggs in the CDC basket. That test didn't roll out on time. But even had it rolled out on time, my point is simply we still wouldn't have had enough testing in place. So statements that the reason we didn't have testing in place and surveillance was because of the mistakes the CDC made, I don't think those hold true. It's certainly clear that CDC made mistakes in getting that test out.
Doctor, given your relationship with the administration, maybe you can then shed some light on why those tests weren't put forth earlier. There have been reports in the Financial Times, I think, in the past 72 hours over the weekend, or maybe it was last Friday, suggesting that Jared Kushner was advising the president not to buy more ventilators, not to do more testing, in part because he thought that it was actually going to scare the market and scare the public. Peter Navarro has come on our air and said that they were on it, that they had gotten on it and gotten on it early. So who's right?
Well, look, I don't believe those kinds of coordinated conspiracy stories. But I'll say what I'm talking about really is back in January, trying to get the commercial labs working on laboratory developed tests, because that takes time. It takes a month or 2 months to do. And eventually those phone calls were made. The academic labs were asked to spin up laboratory-developed tests, and so were the commercial labs, but they were made late, and so they had to be made early.
Doctor, who had to do that, though? Who had to do that?
Probably someone in HHS, either the FDA commissioner or the secretary of HHS, someone in a senior role inside the health agencies and the regulatory agencies, calling the CEOs saying, hey, we need you to do this. We're worried about this problem. We might need this capacity. We don't know. We know it's going to take you 6 months to get these tests in place. We're asking you to start working on it now. Those phone calls get made.
But how could they do that if the administration? How could they do that if the administration was telling them not to, effectively?
Well, first of all, I don't know exactly what the administration told them. What I believe to be true, because it's been reported in the press, was they just weren't asked to do it. It wasn't that they were told not to do it. They were never asked to do it. And so it really wasn't until late February that people were starting to bang on their door asking them to do it. So by February, it took 6 weeks to get it in place. So you really didn't have that testing capacity in place until you got well into March. That's the point. It just was, everything was delayed. That request needed to be put out sometime probably in late January. And so the alternative was we were dependent upon a CDC test and their ability to get a commercial kit available that could then get out to the labs, and the labs would run that kit. And that's where the snafu was. That's where the hang-up was. But my point simply is, even if CDC had done that, we still wouldn't have had a lot of testing capacity. We always needed to get the commercial labs in the game.